Lena Oss had a newborn to keep alive, a Minnesota January that was killing grown men in the open, and a house that everyone who watched it disappear under the snow was sure had become her grave. It was the winter of 1888, on the open prairie of western Minnesota, where the wind came down out of the north with nothing on the whole plain to break it. Lena's husband, Anders, had died in October, a horse and a hard fall, and a night too cold to be found in, and left her a one-room claim shanty, a cow, and a child born 3 weeks before Christmas. There was no one else, no family within 40 miles, no neighbor near enough to hear her, no one who would come to dig her out. No husband, no help, and a baby that could not be let to get cold, not once, not for an hour. The neighbors were not cruel. They were scattered and frightened and fighting their own cold. But they watched the snow bank up against the widow Oss's little shanty, storm after storm, until by the middle of January the house was gone, roof and walls and all, swallowed under a long white drift, with nothing left of it above the snow but a stovepipe standing out of the mound and a thin thread of smoke leaning off it in the wind. And they said, the ones who spoke of her at all, that the widow and her baby were surely dead under there, and that someone ought to dig down and see come the thaw. What none of them understood, what only a woman raised in the far north could have known, was the thing Lena's grandmother had told her when she was a girl in Norway, in a valley where the snow lay deep for half the year. Snow is not the enemy. Snow is a blanket. A house the snow has buried is warmer than a house the wind can still find. By the time the deep cold of that winter had gone through every thin-frame house on the plain and left families huddled and burning through their fuel and losing the fight, the same neighbors who had called the white mound a grave would come floundering across the drifts to it in the dark, to be let into the warmest room for miles. Because Lena had not been buried by the snow. She had let it bury her, on purpose, and she had known exactly what she was doing. Lena had grown up where people understood the snow. In her grandmother's country, the herders knew that a beast that lets the snow drift over it lies warmer than one that stands clear in the wind. The old people banked their byres and their low houses with snow every winter and thought nothing of it, because they had learned across 1,000 years of hard winters what the settlers on the American plains, most of them from softer places, had never had cause to learn. Settled snow is full of still-trapped air, the way hay is, the way wool is. A foot of it packed over a roof and banked up the walls stops the cold better than 3 walls of good timber and holds the little warmth the house makes inside where it belongs, instead of letting the wind strip it away as fast as a stove can put it out. So where her neighbors shoveled the snow away from their doors and walls to keep a clear, proper house, Lena did the opposite. After the first storms, she did not clear the drifts from the shanty. She helped them. She banked the snow up the walls with a shovel and packed it firm and let it rise storm on storm and cut a short tunnel entry through the drift to the door with a scrap of plank for a roof over it and kept only the stovepipe clear. By the middle of January, the shanty sat inside a shell of snow as thick as a man is tall, and it held its heat on a few sticks a day where her neighbors were burning armloads and still waking cold. Inside, with the baby, Lena was warm. The little house that had frost on its inside walls in November now sat quiet and dim and warm as a root cellar. The one small stove, enough and more than enough, and the child slept and fed and grew, while the worst winter in memory howled itself out a foot of snow away. She told no one, because there was no one to tell. The cold that settled on the Minnesota prairie in the last weeks of January was the kind the old settlers would still be measuring winters against 50 years on. It did not break. Night after night passed 30 below, and a wind that packed the drifts hard as a floor and drove the fine snow through every crack a thin house had. The frame shanties and the new lumber houses, thrown up fast in the first years of settlement, leaked their heat into it and could not keep up. And in the middle of it, Lena made the mistake that nearly brought the whole thing down on her child. She had been proud of the snow and greedy for its warmth, and she had let it build over the roof as deep as it had built against the walls, deeper, for the wind curled it up over the low ridge into a great soft load. She had thought only of the blanket of it, and not at all of the weight, and settled snow is not light. In the black middle of one night, she woke to a sound she would never forget. A long, low, groaning crack from the ridgepole over her head, the sound of green timber failing under a load it was never built to carry, and a fine hiss of snow sifting down through the boards onto the quilt where the baby lay. She had the child up and against her and into the tunnel doorway before she had finished waking, out where at least no roof could come down on them, and she stood in the killing cold with the baby screaming and looked back at the sagging black line of the ridgepole and understood what she had done. The snow that kept them warm could crush them in their sleep. A blanket that heavy was also a weight, and she had forgotten the second half of the thing to enjoy the first. She did not sleep the rest of that night. She got the baby wrapped and set safe in the sledge in the tunnel mouth, and then she climbed up onto the drifted roof in the dark and the 30 below and shoveled the great soft load of snow off it, arm over arm, hour after hour, until the ridgepole stood clear of the weight. And then she cut a young rafter pole from the woodpile and braced the cracked ridge from beneath, wedged and lashed so it would hold. It cost her a night of terror and a wrenched shoulder that ached for a month, and a good part of her strength she could not spare. She paid it without a word. She would rather be cold and standing than warm and crushed, and so would the child. After that, she banked the walls as deep as ever, but she kept the roof swept clear down to a hand's depth and no more. And she watched the ridgepole the way she watched the baby's breathing, and she never again let the blanket grow into a weight. There was a gray morning after, standing in the swept tunnel mouth with her shoulder on fire and the whole white plain dead and silent to the sky, when Lena thought seriously about giving it up, about bundling the baby and walking the 40 miles to town while she still could, trading the buried house that had nearly killed them for 4 honest walls somewhere that had never groaned in the night over her child. She got as far as harnessing the cow to the sledge. Then she stood in the wind that was already numbing the baby through 3 blankets in the time it took to harness, and she understood that the 40 miles of open plain in that cold was the surer grave by far, and that the buried house, watched and respected, was the only thing between her child and the winter. She unharnessed the cow and carried the baby back down into the warm. By February, the plain was in real trouble. The cold held, and the thin houses failed one after another. The Sons, her nearest neighbors 2 miles east, ran their fuel down to nothing and burned the floor of their lean-to. A young couple newer than the Sons lost their stove to a cracked pipe and spent 3 nights in their coats before they could get to help. A freighter caught out on the road between towns lived by digging his team a snow shelter and lying up in it, which was the only man on the plain that winter using the snow the way Lena used it. And he had learned it, he said after, from a Norwegian. And through all of it, the widow's buried house sat warm. It was the Sunda boy who found her, sent by his desperate father to the widow Asa's place on the chance there was anything left to salvage, and expecting, everyone had told him, to find a snowed-over grave. He floundered up to the white mound with the stovepipe breathing its thin, steady smoke, and he called out, not really believing anyone would answer, and Lena's voice came back to him up out of the snow, and he stood there in the wind, not understanding, until she came up through the tunnel with the baby on her arm, warm and alive and calm, into the middle of a winter that had half the plain convinced she was 2 months dead. He went home and told it, and his father came, and then the others. The buried house on the widow's claim took them in through the worst of that February. The Sundys, the young couple, a family burned out of fuel 4 miles off, down into the warm, dim room under the snow, and Lena fed them and warmed their children and showed them the thing they had all been shoveling away from their own doors all winter. Bank the snow, she told them. Do not fight it. Let it cover you, and keep the roof swept and the pipe clear, and the same snow that is burying your neighbors will keep you alive. Half of them had come from countries where their own grandmothers had known it, and had left the knowing behind in a warmer land. Lena did not charge, and she did not gloat, and she said little about the 2 months the plain had spent sure she was dead. She only showed them, because a thing that keeps a baby alive under the snow is not a thing you keep to yourself. She proved up the claim. She kept the low house for years, and every winter she let the snow take it, and every winter she swept the roof and watched the ridge, and the people on that stretch of prairie learned to do the same, so that in hard years, the buried houses stood warm while the proud, clear ones failed. Her shoulder never quite forgave the night she cleared the roof, and on the cold days it told her so, and she took it as a fair price and a good teacher. The snow that everyone else spent the winter fighting, Lena used to say, had been trying to help them the whole time. It would bury you either way. The only question was whether you let it bury you warm. If this story made you think of someone who saw shelter where everyone else saw only the thing that was going to kill them, leave their name in the comments. And if you want to hear more of these stories, the women the frontier underestimated and what they quietly knew, subscribe. We tell them one at a time, and we don't rush them.